An intent service is designed to run tasks in the background and is well suited to longer running tasks. Unlike async task or async task loader, an intent service is completely detached from the user interface. It runs in its own thread and doesn't have access to the main thread. It isn't contained within an activity, and it can't call the activity's methods. But it can communicate back to the app's visual tier using broadcast messages. And because it's using broadcast messages, it can send information to any component in the application, not just a single activity. Start by creating a class that extends IntentService. In this project, I'm going to create a new subpackage, and I'll name it Services. Then in that subpackage, I'll create a new Java class, and I'll name it MyService, and I'll set the superclass to IntentService. This class is a member of the package Android.app. I'll get rid of that comment, and I'll fix up a couple of error conditions. First of all, I'll implement a required abstract method named onHandleIntent. The intent service is named that way because it receives instructions packaged in an intent object. The onHandleIntent method will be called automatically when the service starts up, and it receives an intent object as an argument. I also need to create a constructor method. I'll use an intention action and create the constructor method, but then I'll modify it to make it a lot simpler. Instead of saying that I'm going to pass in a value as an argument, I'll get rid of that, but when I call the super method, which does require a string, I'll pass in a literal, which is the name of the class. That just satisfies the requirements of the class structure. I won't be calling that constructor method directly. So now I have a usable service, and I'm ready to go to the next step. I have to register the service in my application manifest. I'll go to the manifest, and I'll add the service declaration right here within the application element. I'll start with a service element, and I'll see a list of my available service classes, and I only have one. I'll select it, and then I'll also add an attribute named exported and set it to a value of false. That attribute means that this service will only be available to my own app's processes and can't be called by other apps on the same device. And that's all the work I need to do in the Android manifest. Now I'll go back to the activity class. In the activity, you create an instance of the service and send it information in an intent. This is the same sort of intent you'd use to send data to a new activity. You can send a single data object, a URI, and you can also add as many data extras as you need to. For this example, I'll just send a URI that will be eventually used to make a web service request. This version of my project already includes a string named JSON URL, and this is the location of my web service on the public web. I'll turn that into a URI object and pass it to my new service. I'll place this code inside the runClickHandler method, and I'll create an intent object. I'll name it intent, and I'll instantiate it with new intent. I'll pass in this as the context, and then myService.class as the definition of the class that I want to instantiate. Next, I need to pass in the data, and this will be the URI. I'll call intent.setData, and it accepts a URI object. And to create the URI object, I'll use URI.parse, and I'll pass in my string JSON URL. If you see any error conditions here, make sure that you've imported the URI class by using an intention action if necessary. Then you can launch the service by calling the startService method and passing in the intent object. You'll see immediately that the amount of code that I'm having to create in the activity is a lot less than when working with an async task or async task loader. All of the complexity of working with the web service will be moved into the service class. So now let's go there and add a bit of code. In the MyService class, the onHandleIntent method will be called automatically. My first step will be to get the intent object and extract any data I need to know what I need to do in the service. I'll create a URI object, and I'll name it URI, and I'll get that value by calling intent.getData. This method returns the URI object that I passed in from the activity. If I also passed in any extra values, I would retrieve them from the intent object at this point as well. Now, in past examples, I've been outputting information using visual components in the activity. But in a service, I don't have access to those. So now I'm just going to use some logcat output. I'll use the log.i code template, and that expands into the log.i call, and after the literal string onHandleIntent, I'll append URI.toString, so I can see what I received. I'll also create a constant that I'll name tag to match the argument that's passed into the log call, and I'll give that a value of the name of the class, myService. And now I'm ready for my first demonstration. I'll go to the Android monitor window and notice that I'm filtering on the tag myService, so those are the only messages I'm going to see. And I'll run the application on my device. When I touch the Run Code button this time, nothing happens in the visual layer of the application, but if I come on back to Android Studio, I'll see the message was delivered, that my onHandleIntent method was called, and it received the URI as the data. Now, there are a couple of other important things to know about intent services. A service has a specific life cycle. Like an activity, it has an onCreate and an onDestroy method. You can override those methods to do setup and cleanup work as necessary. I'll override those methods and just trace them with logcat calls. I'll start off with the onCreate method, and I'll call log.i again, and display onCreate, and then I'll override onDestroy, and I'll add logcat output to that as well. Now, to show exactly what's happening, I'm going to rearrange things on the screen. I'll open my monitor window again, and I'll click the trash can to clear its output. And then I'll also display my live device. This is my Nexus 5X that's running the application. I'll rerun the application on the device, and then when it loads, I'll touch the Run Code button, and I'll see the onCreate method is called first, then the onHandleIntent, and then the onDestroy method. And if I touch the button again, I'll see that the sequence happens again. So you can create as many instances of your service as you want and call them each individually, and each time you'll be creating an instance of the service, and when its onHandleIntent method is finished executing, the service will be destroyed automatically. If you have more than one task to execute all at the same time, you can run them in a sequence. They'll share a single worker thread and a single instance of the service object, but they'll be queued up, and the onHandleIntent method will be called as many times as it's needed. Only one instance of the service object is created, though, so the onCreate and onDestroy methods will be called only once. To demonstrate that, I'll go back to my main activity, and I'll duplicate the call to start service. Then I'll clear my monitor output, so I know I'm starting from scratch, and I'll run the application again. I'll touch the Run Code button, and then we can take a look and see exactly what's happening. I get the onCreate method, then 3 calls to onHandleIntent, and then the onDestroy method. To see this even more dramatically, I'll go to myService.java, and I'll add a sleep call to the onHandleIntent method. I'll call thread.sleep, I'll pass in 1000, and then as I've done before, I'll wrap that call with a try-catch block. I'll go back to the Android monitor and clear the output, and run the code again. And watch what happens in the logcat output. I see the delay of 1 second after each call to onHandleIntent, but again, I'm only getting one onCreate and one onDestroy, and the tasks are executed in sequence. Again, only one copy of the intent service can be run at a time, and that ensures that you're not overloading the device's resources. So those are the basics of using an intent service. If you want to use raw HTTP requests to communicate with web services, this is a great way to wrap them in their own class. It's completely detached from the application's user interface and can easily handle longer processes, such as downloading large datasets or files, and you're completely separating your presentation code from your backend code that's communicating with the web service.